it's now time to move into the next session. So very pleased to welcome Daniel Haslam and Stella Scott for a conversation focused on longer term local leadership. So before I begin, just a reminder that we're using the chat function and pop in as you think as things occur to you. So I'll just introduce you to our speakers first. Stella has worked at Erewash Voluntary Action, a voluntary sector infrastructure organisation, since 2007, having joined originally as an office manager after over a decade of previous work in the voluntary sector. She became CEO in 2014. Since then, the organisation has grown both in terms of staff and in relationships, becoming a trusted organisation with partners including the NHS and local authorities. Stella has contributed to the work of CVSL in a variety of ways, and we're delighted to have her speaking at this year's conference. She has very kindly taken time out of her holiday, so thanks very much to join us today. Daniel is a member of CVSL and a lecturer in Pulse at the Open University Business School. He previously worked in the voluntary sector in a variety of different roles, including with Stella on projects mostly focused on mental health. Daniel also carried out research for his PhD alongside Stella and Erewash Voluntary Action, and their working relationship has continued ever since. So over to you, Daniel and Stella.
Thanks very much, Nick, for that warm welcome. And yes, I'll extend my warm welcome to you, Stella, as well. Great to see you.
Thank you.
One of the things, actually, because we've tied to this longer term local leadership, one of the things that does sometimes get lost, I think, in debates about leadership is that, it doesn't happen in single moments. It happens over a long period of time, often. And some of those things that we've been hearing about in the earlier sessions about relationships and trust and things like that all require time to develop and have their ups and downs over long periods. So that was sort of the theme of our conversation. And with that in mind, we'll sort of go on a bit of a journey. Carol spoke about journeys earlier, of sort of your experience at EVA and EVA's experience locally as well, Rush Voluntary Action, I should say, and what the leadership role has been for the organisation. So kick us off. Tell us a bit about when you first started in your role as Chief Exec at Rush Voluntary Action. What was it like then? What was EVA's leadership role? What were the key relationships and things like that when you first got started, which was 8 years ago or so now?
It was eight years ago this month, so still surviving. A few more grey hairs, but hey ho, that's how it goes. I suppose when I took over from our past chief exec. Relationships, I have to say, with some of our clinical commissioning group colleagues and some of our public health colleagues wasn't the best. It was okay. We were around the table at some of the activities and events, but it wasn't really where I felt it should be, and actually where we could place the voluntary sector, so not just Airwatch Voluntary Action, but the voluntary sector, and having that input into local plans and policies. And I suppose just after I took over, then we had the Vanguard Project in Airwash, which was the NHS Vanguard, which is looking at things in a different way. So it really gave us the catalyst, if you like, to join in, roll our sleeves up and actually prove what the voluntary sector and try and build those better relationships.
Yeah, and that Vanguard Project, well, what they call the Vanguard Project, obviously was the sort of precursor to a lot of the developments we see now, wasn't it, in the NHS, with focus on things like place and integrated care and all those kinds of things. So how was it that Rush Voluntary Action came to be involved in that? What was the process? Because obviously that had a big impact, but how did you get in there?
Well, I suppose if I'm honest, when we came to that table, it was fraught. It wasn't easy because the chief exec at that time of the clinical commissioning groups had a different idea and wanted a different organisation, or actually wanted to set up a voluntary sector franchise, collaborative, whatever you want to call it. But it was a lady called Sarah Baines who was brought into the Vanguard to look at how the community and voluntary sector could be included in the Vanguard, who had worked with Daniel and myself actually on the mental health project that we'd run for 4 years prior to that, who then then sort of said, well, actually, what we've got a CVS, we've got a chief exec that's ready to get going. So, and I have to say, it wasn't the easiest of processes, because there was a lot of sort of, shall I say, hesitancy, in making sure that we were around the table. But I think it was the opportunity that gave us that platform to show what Erewash Voluntary Action could do, and what the reach we had into voluntary and community sector and into statutory partners. So it was probably the toughest year I've had as a chief exec. But the benefits now, as we've moved into place and into the ICS, actually in Erewash we've already got those partners around the table. So we were already in Derbyshire one of the 8 places that were ready to go, because we already had that relationship, with some of our senior GPs, with some of our senior clinicians, some of our senior leaders that actually all already trusted Erewash Voluntary Action and knew where to go.
Yeah, and so it sort of jumps around a bit in the timeline, doesn't it? So the Vanguard pilot project was 2015 to 18, wasn't it? So started, obviously, as you said, very soon after you'd come into post originally, and then that led to sort of those developments over time. One of the things that, obviously, the themes for the conference as a whole today is hybrid ways of working, and one of the things that I sometimes think about in relation to local infrastructure organisations, because they have that role in supporting other voluntary sector organisations, is that often that sort of hybridity comes in a leadership context, in terms of how you both work with often public sector partners. So we talked a lot about the NHS there, but also how you do that work with your member organisations and the wider community to involve them in leadership. So could you talk a little bit about that balance and how that's been managed, particularly in these new ways of working that you're moving towards?
Yeah, and I think that is always the challenge of, certainly it's a conversation that we're having in Derbyshire about does infrastructure, so do CVS represent the voluntary sector, or are they the voice of, or and that's an age-old conversation, I think. I think for us, we have lots of networks and forums that we talk to voluntary community sector. So we've used those to sort of say, well, this is what's happening. What do you think? Are we going in the right direction? And we've got some quite big players in Erewash that we can use as a sounding board, if you like, for what's happening in place and what's happening certainly within the Vanguard. And we did a lot of health as a social model. So healthy Erewash events where we brought key players, local public, in to have those conversations on different pieces of work. So I think it's really sort of important that we don't just go playing around the big table, if you like, and not forget why we're there, because that is that balance of, we work right from tiny community mutual aid networks through the pandemic. I mean, Dame Sarah was talking earlier about, being proud of what's happened through the pandemic with local voluntary community. We have to remember that actually we sat around the table to benefit them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, I think, about how that fluctuates, and the priorities differ, particularly for infrastructure organisations, in terms of where the focus goes. There are lots of pulls in different directions, and that's a massive challenge, because not least for capacity reasons, funding reasons, and those kinds of things. One of the things I was interested in as well, to get your perspective on today, is that, so we've sort of covered several areas there. When you came into post, we had the NHS Vanguard pilot project, which really sort of supercharged a lot of those relationships and things. And we've obviously had the pandemic, which sort of supercharged a lot of that community activity, or particularly the focus on it. But in between, obviously, so from 2018 to 2019, really, it seemed for me as an outsider that there's a bit of perhaps it's slightly a vacuum in terms of stuff that was happening, particularly from an NHS perspective after the pilot project ended. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that from a leadership point of view, because obviously some of those relationships that have been built up weren't there anymore immediately afterwards.
And I think that, that is always, we talk a lot around trust, partnerships, and that being very often personal when it should be organisational, but you can't help taking the people out of the programme. And, to some degree, we've had lots of people then that when the Vanguard finished, their contracts finished. And then you're trying to work out who it is that you need to speak to next. I mean, luckily now with Place and with the Erewash Help Partnership now, which is reformed around the Place board and everything else, a lot of those partners have come back in and want to work back in Erewash, which is great. And Sarah, the lady that I talked about earlier, she actually works now in public health as one of the leads for locality. So that's really good that, when they go into work in a different organisation, then you very often find out they come back and want to work. But I think it was a little bit of a vacuum, but I don't think as much as some of our other colleagues in some of our other patches in Derbyshire, because I think a lot of the Erewash conversations still continued beyond Vanguard, and and as soon as Place came back on, it was like, right, we know who we need round the table, let's get it sorted. And like I say, it mobilized really quickly, where I know in other areas people have struggled to find out the key people they need to make that happen.
Yeah, and that link between individuals and organizations, and where the relationship is with one or the other, or hopefully both, that's really tricky to manage, isn't it? And I don't know if you've obviously there were key individuals, but do you think there was any approach that sort of you used, that EVA used more widely, that allowed that almost sort of I guess critical mass to develop, so that the organisation, in this case the NHS organisation in Erewash, knew sort of not really didn't necessarily link to a particular individual, but the organisation itself had that organisational knowledge to know, okay, if we want to do this kind of work with the community or with the voluntary sector as a whole, we will go to Erewash Voluntary Action. Anything in particular that you think helped with that?
I think again that was down, a lot of it was down to Sarah and her belief in what we could do because of the past work. But I think also we set up a community connectedness project, which was helping to get local people as connectors and to help local people. It's the age-old thing we hear in the sector: people don't know what they don't know. And that was a theme around the whole of the Vanguard, that how do you get people to know what they don't know and need to know or want to know. And that was a really, really good project, which actually showed the value of local people in local decisions and local sharing of knowledge, if you like. So when our primary care network then had GP link workers, social prescribers, it was instantly a feed into, well, actually the best place to Erewash Voluntary Action, because they've already got the community connectors, it fits in with all that. So I think a lot of the hard work and the commitment we gave to our, health colleagues paid off in that way. And we had one GP link worker, and now I've got 6. So, the whole organisation has grown in strength. When I took over in 2014, we had 8 members of staff. We've now got 24, which brings its own challenges.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We'll maybe touch on some of those in a minute as well. But yeah, so just sort of to reflect on that then, and I'll sort of paraphrase, and feel free to correct me if you disagree, but I always get the impression that it's sort of the if we look at the time aspect, things that you have done over time leave a legacy to some extent, whether it's with the individuals involved, or whether it's the organisations through projects that continue, or whether it's through even just the paperwork, the minutes from a meeting that says, oh, we can work with Erewash Voluntary Action on this thing 5 years ago and we can still do it now. All those kinds of things really help to make those connections and add up over time, I would say. Would you agree with that one?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, that the legacy for me has to be, that it's Erewash Voluntary Action, not Stella Chief Exec. And that's, that's another challenge, as 2 years' time, retirement's approaching, and that is the next challenge, really.
Yeah, and that touches on something else again that you've spoken. I know you've spoken about before, which is that this increased involvement of the voluntary sector, of Airwatch Voluntary Action in particular, and the increased trust that comes along with that. Trust is something, as I mentioned, that's been mentioned by a few people already today. Creates that risk, and that succession planning stuff that you just spoke about is a risk in itself, isn't it? That if we don't try and move beyond the personal aspect, then that's a significant risk for the organisation and for Erewash locally as well. So maybe how do you feel about risk in a leadership sense from that point of view?
I think there's always a risk, with, I don't know, I might decide to stay in my holiday caravan and not come back. It's but I think that, there always is that risk, but I think we don't necessarily think about it in a way. And certainly, like I say, we're looking 2 years hence and looking at that succession planning from a board meeting in 2 years, in a week's time, to start that planning, because you have to plan it, because you should be planning for any key members of staff. Even an admin worker leaving creates a hole within an organisation. So we need to think about that whole sort of plan of, because if we go with succession planning, I took over from our chief exec as their, deputy chief officer, then we didn't actually fill that post, and that again is a risk, because then that person takes on too much work. So even if we look at succession planning, it could take 18 months before you've settled everything back down again. We've just gone through a whole sort of
You still there, Stella? Oh, might have lost Stella in full flow there, unfortunately. See if she comes back in a second.
I think we're back.
Oh, Stella,
sorry
you're back.
about that. I don't know what happened there. Yeah. I forgot where I got to now. I think that whole succession planning, because if you're gonna recruit from within a team, then that job needs filling, that job needs filling, and last year we went through a whole staff restructure because of the amount of staff we've got. So it's that sometimes the risk is that constant change within teams as well. People feeling not secure, not well, who's the new boss going to be? Will that person be different? And people get used to a way of one person working that another one might not. So I think that's sort of certainly our board's away day, is that consideration about how they manage that process, and actually how we make staff feel that they're still valued and secure within that new structure, whatever it might look like.
Yeah, and that board to chief exec, or what you might call non-executive to executive in other contexts, relationship is particularly important for leadership in the voluntary sector, isn't it? Because of how that works and the responsibilities involved. We've got about 5 more minutes of our chat before we go into the Q&A. So yeah, people, remember to put your questions in the chat, that we will pick them up as we go along. So I was interested as well in, we've touched a little bit on COVID, and obviously that's been a big challenge over the last couple of years. And the previous leadership that Erewash Voluntary Action has been involved in seems to have helped to then address some of those issues that came up in COVID, whether it was local issues or more strategic things. So give us a sort of a brief outline of what Erewash Voluntary Action has done over the last couple of years in relation to COVID. What's been new? What's been a continuation of stuff, and the balance between those things?
Yeah, I suppose the biggest challenge was working from home within the staff team. So government says I should work from home. We were saying, well, actually we need some people in the centre, because we run a volunteer centre and we need some people to be around. There were lots of changes around the way that we operate. So all our befriending, because we run a volunteer centre as well, had to stop and had to go online or by phone calls. But we are also sort of asked by the Derbyshire County Council Community Response Unit to be the local response agency for people who needed prescriptions, shopping, those sorts of things that maybe were isolating. So, there were some huge challenges around risk, because, we were asking volunteers or shoppers to go to somebody's house who was isolating, and, that's a whole nother risk assessment that needs to be done. But I think, again, great team, fantastic team, all, sort of just rolling the sleeves up and getting on with it. But, the government guidelines against operational needs and all the rest of it was huge, and probably even more grey hairs than normal.
Yeah, and one of the things as well, obviously, is that from an Airwatch Voluntary Action point of view, some of the things that became really emphasised during the particularly lockdowns were things like food delivery, medicine delivery, that kind of stuff, and they're the kinds of things that Airwatch Voluntary Action was doing a lot of anyway, weren't you, in the community?
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge was things like, it sounds silly, but some medicine prescriptions are controlled prescriptions with, methadone or whatever. And that was, the amount of paperwork we had to complete to be able to go and pick a prescription up was huge. But, again, the team just got on with it. And, and again, I think that, thank you at the end of the week, you've all done great, and our funders were very much, we're not even thinking about monitoring. Just do whatever it is you need to do. If you need to move staff from one thing to another, do it. Just be there to support. It wasn't long before they came back to wanting monitoring, I must admit, but
yeah, and that's a whole other conversation about funders and funding and all that kind of stuff, I think, which we might touch on in the Q&A in a minute, but we'll see what comes through. Okay, so we're about wrapping up. There's one final thing, I guess, really, that I'd be interested to get your, I guess, sort of last thoughts on before we go to the Q&A, which is, because we're talking about over longer term, reflecting back now, what do you think really helped when you first started, or in the couple of years when you first became chief exec, that's really come to fruition now? Was there anything in particular?
I think perseverance, not giving up, not sort of walking away thinking, oh, well, they don't want to do it that way, and just that sort of ability to be flexible and say, well, actually, give us this chance to run some healthy Erewash events and show you what we can do. And I think just that perseverance and that constant sort of, and I think being approachable, and not saying not our job, but, and sometimes it wasn't our job, but we might know whose job it could be. So like around mental health, we would have gone to the mental health forum, things like that. So, and that all helps.
Yeah, and that's actually just really interesting before Nick comes back in to run us through the Q&A, that often in leadership, particularly in academic literature, talks about the importance of presence in leadership, as individual leaders being there. But also, I think we can perhaps extend that to Erewash Voluntary Action and say, that presence as an organisation in the local community is really, really important for leadership in that context. Okay, thanks very much, Stella. I'll hand over to Nick and he'll come back to us with some questions, I'm sure.
Thanks very much. That was a really fascinating conversation. So we've got some questions popping in. I might have some of my own as well. So first question is, what practical steps would you take, or are you taking now, for succession planning in the context where, as you describe, individuals and their relationships matter so much?
Okay, so I think for me, it's around what the new structure is going to look like at Erewash Voluntary Action. We know full well that my job has grown and grown and grown, and 40 hours a week, 37 hours a week, whatever, doesn't you can't fulfill it in that, and hence very often why I'm still working on my laptop when I'm on holiday. So, having a new structure. But I think, for me, if we can get whoever in place before, 6 months before as I start to back out, the new person starts to come in and help to build that relationship. So not to just say, right, I've gone, here's Daniel, he's going to be the new, it's that sort of being able to sort of introduce people. And for me, the biggest thing is making sure that whoever takes over has that ethos of EVA, to Erewash Voluntary Action, because we've built that trust, that relationship. And I think the biggest thing for me is, sounds horrible, but not necessarily the team, because I know that'll be okay, because we've got team leaders and we've got structures in place, but it's actually how we passport from one person to another person and pass on that trust and that partnership working.
Thanks. And that kind of reflects back to some of the comments made by the previous speakers talking about ethos and values. How do you maintain, and what do you understand by the ethos of your organisation, how you maintain it as a kind of leader or de facto leader in an organisation?
It's a really tricky one. I think if you've got directive from your board through your chief exec about this is what we are, this is what we're going to do. So we have had people approach us, for example, in the past that want us to do a piece of work and actually it doesn't fit. So I think it's around not having mission drift in sort of, this is what the organisation is, this is what it wants to achieve, these are the projects we'll do within this. But actually, there are things that we might say no. And I think one of the biggest challenges is, do you stay pure infrastructure, so CVS, or do you become a deliverer of service? Because as I said, we've got 6 social prescribers now, so that's a delivery of a service. But it's lucrative because the amount we get for that project helps us to do other things.
I think that leads on to a kind of thought. How do you manage that tension, and how do you manage that development of your organisation in that space?
I think for me, it's bringing everybody on board, bringing everybody with you. So not me working with the board and just having that question, that discussion at the board, and then so it's around talking to the team, about what should happen, what could happen, what could we do different, what are we doing that maybe doesn't work, and having that 2-way process of talking to the board. Well, I suppose a 3-way process of the board, our partners, and our staff team, because they are our biggest asset. And we have had tensions in the past. We have had in the last 2 years we've had some key staff left, not in the nicest way, and that created its own tensions. A bit like saying Dame Sarah was saying, that every organisation's got those tensions, but it's how you deal with them and how you make sure that that's there. And I have to say, I a year ago I had a senior administrator appointed, and again, having that someone to talk to within the organisation. Our chair is really good. Our chair is a new chair in this last year. He's really keen to be part of the organisation, but also I have a sort of mentor, if you like, within our board who is part of a big national charity. So having that sort of wrap around, if you like, to be able to make sure that and my staff will challenge me. Why are you thinking that way? Is that what we should be doing? And I think that's really, really useful to have that ethos of being able to challenge.
Thank you. I think we've got tensions coming up again in our next question. So there's this question from the chat. So how do you manage tensions between different community groups interested in the same agenda? Perhaps one who may have a closer working relationship than the other.
I can't say we've had that many. I mean, I suppose the biggest tension in the area is very often from the larger organisations. So where we've got things like place, and we've got an Erewash place, which is only a small area at the side of some places, and then you might have Derbyshire-wide organisations, and I think the tensions there are the difficult one to manage, because certainly does Derbyshire Carers want to go to 8-place partnerships. So part of it now in Derbyshire is a Voluntary Sector Alliance that brings those Derbyshire-wide organisations together, so they don't have to go to every place. But I think we try and be as fair as we can with organisations. We work with quite a few community networks. They're all different, but it's about changing your approach and working with them, not telling them what they should do, if that makes sense.
Can I just interject really quickly on that
Sure.
one? Because I can think of an example, Stella, of where that's happened actually. Erewash Voluntary Action. And it's very difficult to talk about without naming the group or even the issue, because that would identify the group. But let's say it was a health-based organisation that I remember had some tension within them and split off. So they were still dealing with the same issue and still wanted the same representation locally. And I remember you telling me that you had different staff at Erewash Voluntary Action work with those different groups. So they still got the support, and you were trying to encourage that work together, but ultimately, you know, they still stayed separate. I don't know if you remember that particular example that I'm talking about, but
I do. And what we did, well, our development worker worked with one group and I worked with the other group, and we were hoping to bring them back together because they were a split off from one group set up, and then another one was a bit of a splinter group. But again, you know, we just put that in place so that we could both work with them. So independently, they both got advice and guidance. And actually, you know, my development worker and myself would talk about it on a regular basis. And actually, we've got two really thriving groups now that work independently. And actually, a lot of their members who've got a really key sort of medical condition can go to 2 groups a week. And very often, a lot of them do. But now they get on. But at that point, it was like, there's no way I'm going to that group. I'm not going to that group. And if you go to that group, you can't come to this group. And there were some real tensions. But I think, you know, by looking at what is the tension, where can we put our efforts? And it wasn't really what I wanted to spend my chief officer's time on either. But, you know, when you've only got one development worker, you can't do any more. But it is around that sort of just listening to what's happening and then thinking about how can we take that forward.
Right, this concept of mission drift obviously has provoked a few reflections. So, you know, one in the chat saying not having mission drift is a really important point. So many voluntary organisations do get pulled in other directions, normally as a result of chasing funding. And the tension between mission drift versus innovation and agility. How do you sort of manage that and, you know, avoid mission drift or, you know, refreshing the mission?
I think you always have to be aware of what's on the horizon, what's the potentials. I think for us, it's around, you know, we want to stay true to our development of community voluntary sector within Erewash and within Derbyshire, because we sit on quite a few Derbyshire activities. And I chair a 3D network, which is all the CVS and volunteer centres across Derbyshire. But I think for us, our sort of aim's always been that we'll look at it if it doesn't exist, but if it exists, we won't compete for it. So if there was a tender came out for a local luncheon club, there is no way we would tender for it because there's already a luncheon club. We'd support the luncheon club to get that contract. And I think for a lot of organisations, they've become competitors with their members and their sector, and I think that's really important that we don't drift into that just to get the money.
Certainly, and that actually brought up an interesting point. You've talked a lot about place and place being very important to your organisation. So one of the commenters said, you know, do you have alliances cross county, cross districts? You know, Erewash being so close to Nottingham, and how you kind of manage that whilst keeping the focus on place.
Very interesting comment, that one, because our postcode is Nottinghamshire, but we're covered by Derbyshire, so that creates its own tensions. We don't tend to work across Notts because they're very different, but across Derbyshire we do have the Voluntary Sector Alliance that is being set up by a guy called Wynne, who is working as part of through one of our local CVS. So looking at those bigger Derbyshire partnerships, that those bigger Derbyshire organisations like autism, carers, all those ones that work across our sector. And then we also have, as I just mentioned earlier, 3D, which is a collective of all the volunteer centres, all the CVS and some specialist infrastructure organisations across Derbyshire and the city. So the city is always the biggest thing for us because a lot of the Derbyshire contracts don't cover the city, and you know the city contracts don't cover Derbyshire. So there is that tension in Derbyshire. But we do work quite collaboratively across. We have projects that are run through one CVS, and then we all deliver a bit across the county. So Home from Hospital is a quick sort of example of, you know, one of our colleagues, CVS colleagues, has the contract, but then we all deliver it. So we deliver the Airwash bit and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of collaborative working across Derbyshire.
Okay, thank you. Now, in some of your question or comments, you've talked about risks, and particularly risks in terms of COVID, and you also talked about the idea of the 40-hour week. And I see you're speaking to us from your holiday. So how do you manage? You know, there's risks throughout the system. So how do you manage like the risk to personal well-being, to volunteers, to your staff, but also to those service users? How do you manage that as a kind of leader, so that maintains the balance and kind of well-being?
I think for me, it's around having the right people that are managing those teams. So, like I say, I had 23 members of staff to manage, 2 years ago, and we put in team leaders, so they've got their own little teams to work. We did have an incident last week where we had a major incident with one of our GP link workers, and we brought in things like Health Assured to make sure that the staff have got access to 24-hour counselling and things like that. So I think for me, it's about being available. My phone's never off. They've all got my personal mobile, and very often when I'm on the holiday, I'll get a call saying, I'm not really happy about this. And, I deal with it. But I think for me, moving forwards, we need to have different structures that don't put that onus all on one person, because that really is a challenge. I've only done this one today because we're a long time with Daniel and wanted to support him because he came to work with us to do his piece of research through the Vanguard. So, but I have spent hours and hours writing tenders while I'm on holiday, and I think that for me, the risk going forwards has to mitigate that, so that whoever you're asking to come in and do that job isn't expected to do all that.
So I think maybe just one final question. It's probably the same question as I posed to the previous speaker. So, what to you is a good leader, and how do you manage the tensions between being effective and keeping your ethos?
I think it's about being true, about being fair, because I think there has to be a fairness across your teams, across your partnerships, in that you don't favour anybody within the team or seem to favour anybody within the team. But I think there has to be a reality that actually you can't do it all, and sometimes we have to say to the staff, no, it's not possible. But having the answer to back that up. So we've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months updating all our policies, all our procedures, and actually embedding that within a bigger staff team, because when you've only got 8 members of staff, that's a lot easier to have that fairness. But I think it's around the team leaders having the same belief and working in the same way. So it's not, well, that team gets to do that way and that team can't do that because that team leader won't let them. So I think it's top down, but I think it's also bottom up, and it's listening.
Thank you. I think that's a good way to end. So thanks very much for your comments, Stella. Really interesting. And Daniel also. So thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And have a good rest of holiday.
Thank you.